Excellent. Thank you so much, Jodie. And thanks everybody for being so accommodating. I would have loved to have been in Queensland this week, but yeah, not the case. So as Jodie said, I will be speaking about understanding how to use Msa Index to make informed business decisions. I suppose as consultants and advisors, probably be touching a little bit more on what you need to know about the MSA program for your clients. So things like the requirements that we expect of producers. I'll be talking about eating quality specifically and what affects that, and then also how you can be using Carcass feedback and incorporating that into business and on-farm decisions. Let's go to the next slide. I suppose, why should we be interested in the eating quality of our beef? MSA really came about to tackle this issue that we were having as an industry around the inconsistencies in terms of eating quality when it came to beef and sheep meat. So MSA's been around for more than 20 years now, and it's built on a plethora of research where we've asked everyday consumers to partake in any research that we've run around testing eating quality, both on farm but along the supply chain as well. And at the end of the day, we really do need to remember that consumers are the only point where money enters the supply chain, and as they go and purchase our beef and sheep meat, either at their butchers or their retail supermarket, everybody along the supply chain kind of takes their little bit of a share out of it before it gets right back down to the production level. And I think the other one for us to remember as well is that when people are paying more for beef and sheep meat than they ever have before, we really can't afford to let them down. So eating quality is that expectation, as same as traceability and food safety. We expect that anything that we purchase is going to meet our expectations when it comes to food and specifically proteins. So just quickly into the next slide, when we get asked, oh, what's the benefit of being an MSA producer? One of our first ones is around carcass feedback. So being able to receive detailed carcass feedback. If you think about a lot of beef producers, they spend years and years making all these genetic decisions, managing their herd and basically bringing through an animal that's, at least sort of 18 months, if not more. So bringing them through, and at the end of the day, all you have to go off of how that animal performed is that carcass feedback. So it's a really important one that we provide back for producers. Like Jo was saying in her presentation, in terms of food safety and traceability, MSA provides market access in terms of eating quality. So things like being able to differentiate product is a huge component of MSA. So for producers, having a few different market options available, and then also price premiums. So what I've got there is just in the last financial year, what we do is we look at the over-the-hooks prices between MSA graded cattle, so animals that have come through an MSA program at an abattoir, and then non-MSA. And in the last financial year, on an average of a $2.94 kilo carcass, it worked out to be about a $79 head premium if for an animal coming off grass or not from an NFAS accredited feedlot, and then for grain-fed, a $30 head premium. So it works out, if we multiply that over the 53% of cattle that were MSA slaughtered last year, works out to be around $157 million delivered back to Farmgate just in price differentials. With MSA, it is a whole of supply chain program, so we have requirements in place at every point in which we know there may be impacts on eating quality before it gets to the end consumer. So I suppose for everyone in the room, particularly knowing what those producer requirements are really important. But also we have some requirements in place for sale yards and agents also. I won't go into detail of those today, but you can find those in our MSA standards. And if you've got any questions, feel free to ask about that too. But in terms of producer requirements to supply MSA cattle, we do need producers to be registered with the program. They have to have correctly filled out LPA, NVD and MSA vendor declarations. I won't go into too much detail on that considering Joe's presentation just before. The cattle do need to be kept on property for a minimum of 30 days and no entire males, no sick or severely injured animals. And for cattle that are being sent directly from the property to a processing plant, these need to be processed within 48 hours of dispatch. Another big one that's quite important is having access to water when actually not in transit. So in the yards, pre-transport, and then when they get into lairage. So that's also a process requirement that we expect from our licensed plants. So in terms of what actually does impact eating quality, we measure quite a lot of things when it comes to MSA, and I'll just flick up a feedback report in a second. But in terms of all the things that we've been able to measure from on-farm and at the plant, we've culminated that into the grading process, and we know the factors that do have an impact on eating quality. So these are things like, particularly important in the north, tropical breed content, but marbling is a big one, ossification, and rib fat, but also things like pH, like I said, rib fat, and then what happens after the carcass is hung up, so hang method, and we know that cut aging, individual cuts and cook method all have an impact on the eating quality score that consumers will give a piece of meat, and how they expect that to, how they interpret how that's eaten. So with our producers, we give a carcass feedback sheet that looks like that. So what I have up on the board now, I don't expect anybody to be able to actually see that. To get the whole page in a slide, we have to make it pretty small, but that's a lot of information that we give producers. And for producers, not all of that information is necessarily required for them to know. We do have a key in the bottom, so on the sort of in the bottom of the feedback sheet. But the most important thing for producers to be able to understand how their carcasses performed is by using the MSA index. And what that index is it's a single number that explains the overall eating quality of a carcass. So I hope you can see the steer on the left-hand side of the screen. But if you look at the cuts within that carcass and you can see the tenderloin, so I'll just try and bring my cursor across. So you see the tenderloin here, it has an eating quality score predicted to be 79. So that's a really high eating quality product. Scores are between 0 and 100, so that's a 5-star type product. But it only is worth 1.7% of the whole carcass weight, that individual cut or muscle. So what it is, it's a weighted average of all 39 primal or predominant cuts and their eating quality scores. And what it can be used to do is it only takes into account the factors that producers have an impact on. So we know things like hang method can change the eating quality of some of those butt and rump muscles, but producers have no control of how their carcasses are hung. So the index only takes into consideration factors that can be impacted on farm, and it sets default factors like an Achilles hung carcass. So over time, we have seen an improvement in carcass quality. In the last financial year, the average MSA index was 57.62. This is slightly down from the year before, and the reason that we did see this was to do with taking into account these as calculated over financial years, the number of cattle that were on grain in that last financial year and potentially being treated with a HGP. So that's some of the influence that we may have seen to see this drop just in the last financial year, but like I said, over time this has been increasing. And the other thing that we can do with knowing the index is we can see how our cattle perform against others. And so every 2 years we put out an eating quality insights report, and we also have benchmarking features available in MyMSA. So as a producer, when you log in, you're able to see where your cattle sit against others based on a regional, state or national basis. And it kind of is just that line in the sand that allows you to know where you perform against others and then start to think about, well, what can I target in terms of production factors to improve this? So when it comes to the big hitters of impacting MSA index, we've sort of got those first 3 carcass inputs there on the screen: HGP status, if they're a milk-fed dealer, and sale yard. So if you think about in Queensland, considering the number of cattle that are within feedlots, HGP is a huge one that has quite a negative impact on eating quality. I won't spend too much time talking about HGP, but we do know that it does impact eating quality in terms of decreasing tenderness. Not a huge one, but milk-fed vealer is something that we probably see more in states like Western Australia and a little bit in Victoria. And then also if cattle have come via a sale yard, those extra stresses that are placed on having cattle on and off a truck an extra time and in another environment has that impact on eating quality again. But those things are all management decisions. And then if we think about this next set of attributes that impact eating quality, like marbling, hump, height, and ossification, these are quite high impactful factors, but these can be managed with genetics and on-farm management. So if anybody has access, I quite like using this QR code when out at workshops and nobody has the excuse that they can't use it anymore or they can't use a QR code. So if you're able to, see if you can bring up the calculator, but what we have available for our producers both in a mobile version and also within MyMSA is these MSA Index Calculators. So it gives people the ability to be able to go in and start making changes on some of those factors and understand how that has an impact on the index. So I suppose I've just got a little bit of an example here that we use with producers, and it's around this idea of, well, if I was to change a few of my production factors and focus on a few things, how can I actually shift that MSA index on farm? So this is just an example. We've got a 300 kilo carcass. Tropical breed content is marked as an X, so it does contain tropical breed content as specified on the MSA vendor declaration, a hump height of 90 mil, os of 180, MSA marbling of 300, and a rib fat of 5 mil. What that gives us is an MSA index of 55.52. Now, if you're in Queensland, that kind of sits you just below being in the top 50%, and on a national scale, you're kind of just in sort of across the bottom 25%, right? So you're just under the top 50% in Queensland. So I'm just going to show you what some of the things, if we're making decisions, changing certain factors, what does that actually look like? So one of the big things that we probably got a little bit of stick for MSA in the last while is around hump height and tropical breed content. So I'm just going to preface this with the fact that all breeds are eligible for MSA grading, and that the most important thing is that you have animals that suit your environment first and foremost. So what we've seen in the range of hump heights across Queensland is that they range basically anywhere from 50 mil, so that's what we would expect to see on, say, an Angus, typical Angus type steer, through to 140 mil. Now, if we were to change that and be selecting animals that have maybe slightly less tropical breed content, but again, still animals that suit your environment, if you went from a 90 mil hump height back to an 80 mil hump height, that's worth nearly 1.3 index units, right? So the thing about hump height as well is that we measure it in conjunction with weight and sex. So the higher the weight ratio of the animal to that actual hump height, the less impact it has on eating quality. So that's what the variation looks like if we change 10 mil there. If we think about hot standard carcass weight on a per kilo basis, it has a pretty low impact, but if we were to add quite a few kilos on, again, making sure that we're meeting our target market specifications. But if we went to look at putting another 25 kilos hot standard carcass weight on our animals, so going from a 300 to a 325 kilo carcass, it's worth about 0.23 index units. Now, the really important thing though about weight gain and making sure that we're meeting our grids, with weight gain, if you're doing less than 0.8 of a kilo per head per day, then that starts to have an impact on your pH or your glycogen levels in the muscles and can potentially impact non-compliance to pH. So we want to make sure that we've got animals on a rising plane of nutrition pre-slaughter, and that we're not having that potential for animals to go as dark cutters due to nutrition. Our next one's marbling. It's a pretty big impact item, and I think people get quite caught up with, there's a lot of market hype around what marbling means. And I just want to show you that the picture that I have up there is an Osmeat marble score 2 or an MSA marble score 400. Now the graph is showing us that for non-grain fed and grain fed animals, basically 80% of the carcasses that we produce in Australia have a marble score of 400 or below. So if you look at that image of the eye muscle, and that's 80% of the animals that we produce, have a marble score of that or below. So that's a really, really important one, because the perception of what we have with marbling in our head is actually quite different to how it can then impact eating quality. So in terms of MSA marbling, it's a highly heritable trait. I think Tim is on the schedule, we're talking about EBVs, but very quickly here, the thing that we can do to influence marbling is by selecting IMF EBVs in the sire. This is a little bit of work that was done at the University of Adelaide, and it shows that if you went from, and predominantly Angus data, but using a +1 IMF bull to a +3 IMF bull, so those are bulls that are sort of right down the end of each in terms of their percentile bands. In the progeny, you could expect a change of 60 units of MSA marbling. Now, you went from a 300 marble score to a 360, it's worth nearly 1 index unit. And again, I just want to show you, that's what a 0 or MSA 200 and an Osmeat 1 and MSA 300 looks like. So if you can see on the screen there, there isn't a huge amount to the eye that looks like in terms of the intramuscular fat and the marbling, but it has a huge impact on index and eating quality for the consumer. And again, going from a 3 to a 400. Our last big hitter is ossification, and just a description of what os is it's the process of where cartilage turns to bone, and we measure that in the vertebrae. So those are two quite young animals up on the screen. It starts at 100, so we've got an os score of 120 on the left-hand side, os score of 150, and we'll be sending around sort of these slides and notes. But if you have a look at that os score 150, what you can see in the image is that sort of vertebrae capping of the cartilage, turning to bone. So we measure that in the vertebrae, and basically at the same time as an animal is growing and maturing, their muscles are forming more collagen cross-links, they're getting stronger, but from an eating quality perspective, they're getting a little bit tougher. So very quickly, just what do os scores look like in terms of what we see with carcasses coming through and getting graded? Basically, there are things on animals that have been on grain. 50% of cattle that come through for grading have os scores less than 150, and similar, about 60% of non-grain fed or coming from predominantly pasture-fed systems have those os scores of less than 150. Sorry, wrong way. And in terms of how do we manipulate that on farm, again, it's one of those hard ones where you go, there's nothing you can do for that animal that is now hanging up and it's dead, but we can monitor this over time, and we need to remember that whole of life nutrition has a really big impact on ossification. We've seen some data to show that particularly animals coming out of drought in the last few years have probably had, as a whole, higher os scores, even though they've had potentially compensatory growth heading into a feedlot. Whole of life nutrition is super important, as well as those 400 and 600 day weight EBVs. So if we can get animals hitting our target weights at an earlier age, that can improve our os scores over time. And just to show what going from a 180 to a 170 os score is, it's about half an index unit. Now, if we add all of these things up that we've changed, what we actually see is that we've increased the index in that carcass by 3.24 index units. Now, if anyone's sitting there and they're going, oh my God, Laura, all you've done is just change all the numbers. Yeah, that's kind of correct. But at the same time, the only way that we can make improvements is through these small incremental changes, and we can only know what those changes will be if we actually have a look at our carcass data and know how our carcasses are performing on some of those big major traits. So things like your marbling, ossification, weight, and for our northern producers, hump height. So it's taken an animal that we sort of had sitting in the bottom 50% to now being an animal that's on the way to being in the top 25% in Queensland. And I think the importance of all of this is that when you have animals with a higher index, the amount of harvestable cuts, and particularly those 4 and 5 star cuts, become greater proportion of the carcass as your index improves. So what we can see on the screen now is, given that our MSA index is averaged across the nation at 57.62, it floats anywhere between 57 and 58, but half the carcasses in Australia produce what's on the left-hand side of the screen, and half the carcasses in Australia produce what's on that right-hand side of the screen. So for a producer to actually see your data, we have that available in my MSA, And you can start to change so if you want to look at your last 6 months of consignments through to 1 year, you can do that. You can do that on a regional, state and national basis. And we've put in the ability for you to filter out on certain carcass attributes, things like the use of HGP, and for people who are sending MSA cows, being able to filter out on OS score as well. So you're kind of moving your younger consignments away from your older consignments. And what you're able to see is how you perform and what your range of data looks like in terms of your comparison. So on the screen, we've got your results versus the Queensland results. So if anyone's interested in having access to a My MSA account, just please let us know and we can work something out there. The last thing of what we have available for resources that can help producers, first of all, you've got your kill data and feedback sheets. Like I was saying, My MSA has that benchmarking ability, but also ability to look at your compliance and carcass feedback and make customised reports out of those. And every 2 years we put out an Australian Beef Eating Quality Insights report. That's a culmination of all the grading data in the last 2 years. We've also got some tips and tools. Lastly, if you do have producers that consign MSA, it's really important. Things to check prior to consignment is that their MSA accreditation and licence status is current. We've had some issues before where the MSA component of the LPA accreditation may have been missed and their MSA was not currently licensed. So yeah, just you can do that by jumping onto the MSA pick search. Punch in the pick and it'll tell you if your client is current or inactive. So that's it from me. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take those.